Welcome to another version of the Mere Mortals book reviews. Today I have for you David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is a mammoth book, 900 pages. It was written in 1850 and was the eighth novel by Dickens. It was actually part of a serialization, so it was first published, I think, in actually 1849 to 1850 as part of a magazine series, and it would come in installments of, I think it was close to 20 all up. I'm not sure how many chapters there are, 40 something, probably close to that. And as it goes through the book, you can sort of tell that each chapter was, I guess, part of a longer series, but sort of could be read alone as well, and written in such a style as to draw the reader in and make them wonder, okay, what's going to happen in the next one, as it does have a certain structure to it in that way. It's fictional, but it is largely autobiographical as well. So Dickens himself had a very tough life. Starting off when he was young, he was part of a huge family. I think he had nine siblings. His father got into bankruptcy when he was young. He personally had to work in some sort of like a tarring factory where they would have like papers that needed tarring with this black ink or something, tying up and putting with a bow on and then sending it out. So instead of going to school, I think for 4 months he worked in this sort of place, and just going through this, being a gentleman but living as a pauper, I guess, and going through that world. So a lot of the book revolves around the young David Copperfield as a child, and then growing up through these experiences. So the general plot of it's about a young boy, David Copperfield. He's given birth to by his mum, with his Aunt Betsy making a very short appearance at the start of the novel and then disappearing. And I suppose it goes through his life as in different stages. One as a very young kid, so sort of in the age of 9-ish probably, and goes through a stage of that. Goes to another stage of him as a young adult, so getting into like early manhood, 17, 18. Goes through that stage of him, I guess, developing and becoming more self-sufficient, reliant. And then a final stage of him as a older man, still relatively young, I think, probably in his 30s. They don't exactly list his age at any points. It's really just a telling of him, of different places in his life. Plenty of characters that he meets along the way, and it's a 900-page book, so I'm not going to be able to do a very good detailing of the plot in a sufficient time. I'll get onto some of the themes of the book. One of the first and major ones is, I guess, the brutality of it. Even though while reading it, I thoroughly enjoyed it and did not feel it really at any point that it was like a drag or a burden to read about these things. So much goes wrong for him in his life. He has a really rough childhood. His mum dies when he's young. Spoiler alert for all of this. His mum dies while he's still relatively young, and he's got this like overbearing, very ruthless sort of stepfather. He gets put to work in a factory, escapes and finds his aunt, and has to sort of live on the streets for a while, trying to get to her. And there's just these constantly throughout the book, he'll might go in through a phase where everything's sort of nice, but then you can see the signs creeping up of something bad coming up. So this will happen, for example, where Uriah Heep, who is, I guess, one of the main antagonists in the novel, you can see his gradual ascent to power over one of his like benefactors, and his designs on his sister, his sister in his mind of Agnes. And you can also see it with Dr. Strong and his wife, the sort of straining tensions that are hinted at earlier in the novel, and gets to be like growing into larger and larger sort of a deal, I guess. The gradual onset of not dementia, but a sort of type of craziness with Mr. Wickfield, another of his like father figures, there's bankruptcy for his wife, ruination, and towards the end of the novel, he has the death of three loved ones close to him. And so all of this, like throughout the novel, it doesn't focus solely on the negative aspects, but it does really paint a picture of what life was like back in the the 1850s and the 1800s of just how desolate and ruthless it could be. There was disease, there was death, there was all these bad things, and then you take into account humans and their own propensity for I guess selfishness and all the base human instincts that we have. So it was a bit of a depressing novel in that sense, but while reading it as well, I never got the point, the feeling that like the apathy, the general, what's the point of all of this? It was I guess for me it was still a quite a hopeful novel, and one that made you feel like, if you put your work in and you can try and see the brighter side of life, it's sort of like that mental aspect of being positive even in these absolutely terrible situations. The class differences back then were huge, absolutely huge, and the social aspect of it was really intriguing, seeing just how much the changes could come based on your social status and where you could rise to, and what options were ahead of you. And I guess in this sense, it's so much more interesting nowadays to see where you could literally move from wherever you are, plunk yourself in a new place, and start off again. In this time, that was almost impossible. If you were a social outcast in one place, you really didn't have options to go somewhere else and make afresh. One of the only options they had for that was actually sorted out in the end of the novel, where quite a few of the characters emigrate to Australia, and basically that's what they had to do to start a new life, was to literally move across half the world. There was very severe punishments, and these were tightly upheld as well. So if you, for example, the little Emily, I guess she's sort of like an orphan, a poor girl who has aspirations of being a lady, of being of higher class. And to do this, she runs away with Steerforth, but it's I guess like a gentleman marrying, or he doesn't even marry her, a gentleman eloping with a girl many class levels beneath him. And you can see it with his mum, who sort of disowns him. You can see it with everyone in the town that little Emily was from, disowning her and treating her as, in their minds at least, as a whore, a hussy, or whatever. Eloping with someone who she's not even married to, like, what a shock, what a absolutely disgusting thing to do. So you could see this in many cases, the changed circumstances as well, with David, where he goes from being like a young gentleman with a wealthy aunt and he's all taken care for. She loses the money, and then instantly for him everything changes. He needs to start working. He needs to start becoming self-sufficient. He takes a very big dip in his social standings, and that means the people who associate with him also, I guess, take that into account and will treat him differently. These things still go on nowadays, but I feel you do have the option, at least, of it seems to be more of a fair system in one way, where you could use mass media, use the internet, use the ability to move places, and if you're willing to put in the work and effort, you can make something of yourself. There's also the sexual aspect of it, which is if you're like a whore or a prostitute back then, you are considered filth of the filth. It's real interesting. I've always sort of struggled to understand how the women get all the blame for it, and there's not as much social outcasting of the men, because I guess we all know the base aspect of of sexuality for men is very different from women. The striving for that sexual fulfillment and release, and you can put it back to evolutionary biology. And for men, it's you only have to have sex with her once, and then you can leave, and then she has all the burden, and there's that sort of understanding for it. But I just never understood in those times how it was the women always who were the socially outcast, and the men who visited them sort of had a free pass in a sense. A very different time from how it is now. I think there's a little bit more of equality with regards to that nowadays, but it still sticks around as well. Anyway, interesting to see. So the class differences were, I feel, a lot stronger back then, even though you could still point them out today. David's maturation through the stages of his life as well is interesting to see. As a young, innocent boy, very naive, unsure of his place in the world, and I guess struggling to survive, struggling to just stay alive and make sense of all the things that's happening around him. His I guess, poor treatment by his stepfather, and the overbearing, uncompromising, I wouldn't say brutality, but the lack of care from his first school teacher. And the principal of that school is pretty terrible to see. His burgeoning manhood when he, I guess, becomes of age, but he still feels very inadequate. He's not sure of himself. You can really see this in his interactions with Mr. Littimer, who described as always respectable. Everything about him is respectable, and he feels just so insignificant and unworthy compared to this other gentleman. That then goes into his next stage, which is the struggling and grinding for his place in the world, realizing that he's got to make it on his own and he can't rely on other people. And then finally to the end, where his acceptance and appreciation of life. He goes through all these terrible things and then has this opportunity to make things right at the end and I guess try and live the best life he can. So those were a couple of themes, some observations personally from me of the book. I really like the small, sort of seemingly superfluous. Oof, that's a difficult word. Details that animate characters in the book. You can see this with, Uriah always rubbing his chin and being sneaky that way. His Aunt Betsy continuously pacing the room and Traddles with his spiky hair and optimism. Each of the characters, I guess he puts them in a box in a way, and they sort of stick to it. You don't see any of their characters, although some can grow and evolve. You really see them being portrayed as having these innate personality things that make the character and really bring them to life. I really, really enjoyed that. This was actually the second book by Dickens I've read. The first one I read was The Tale of Two Cities, and I really enjoyed that one as well. The style change he uses to go between these different passages in his life is really interesting. It gets this rapidly changing scenes, this sort of ephemeral quality to the chapter, and it'll usually only be one chapter, maybe two, between I guess the big part of his life, two big parts of his life. And it's just a really, I don't know how to describe it, a flighty type of writing. It's just, he managed to change it so quick. And it doesn't feel clunky at all. It feels like it's just flowing smoothly. One section has ended. He's I guess, building up to the next section. The strong characters in the book and their ability to change, but they also stayed the same as well. So some were just so outlandish and exaggerated. Mr. Micawber in the book, you have to read it personally to understand just how ridiculous his style of speaking and writing, and it's just really interesting seeing how it's a character who has, I guess, no firm backbone on reality, and his wife as well. They always have these grand aspirations. They're always constantly getting into debt and having to move on to another place. And I don't know, there's just something about their style where Dickens really captures this character, and it's like reminiscent of a real life personality that you might know, or a personality type. There's just something about it where he really captures the character and brings it to life in the book. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. Really, really enjoyed it. It's a mammoth book. It'll take you a while to get through. The storytelling is superb. There was only probably a couple of moments in the book where I was reading it and not fully appreciating it, or reading it and not, fully understanding what's going on. But very, very quickly it would change, and I'd get back into the flow of the novel again. Really nice for being able to just pick up at any point and just saying, like, and sort of knowing already where it is, and if you've sort of forgotten parts previously, it's okay. And he just weaves it all in so nicely. You particularly see this on The Tale of Two Cities, where it's like this grand lead up to this culminating event. It's not as culminating in this one, but you can sort of see what's going to happen beforehand. And even though that happens, it doesn't ruin the novel for me. You can sort of guess what's going to happen to little Emily chapters before what the big reveal or the big event. But it still doesn't ruin it. It still makes you really enjoy the novel and just how it's structured and how it's written, or at least personally for me. So overall, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Really enjoyed the novel. Recommend Dickens to read as a writer. I want to read other novels of his for sure. But yeah, you just got to set aside some time for it, because they are thick books. That's all for the moment. I hope you enjoyed.